Bonsoir à toutes et tous. Bienvenue donc à l'École nationale supérieure des arts décoratifs, dont je suis le directeur, et je tiens donc à vous souhaiter la bienvenue, à vous dire combien je me réjouis de votre présence nombreuse, en dépit du fait qu'une grève complique un petit peu les transports. Oh, mais je reconnais voilà, des visages que je suis ravi de retrouver là, dans l'assistance, que je n'avais pas vu depuis longtemps. Et je me réjouis voilà, qu'une communauté là, qui s'intéresse aux questions de design graphique soit ici réunie pour la première conférence, la première rencontre de ce cycle qui s'intitule Un déséquilibre précis à propos de l'idée que l'on a de la Suisse. Comme celles et ceux qui connaissent un petit peu l'histoire de cette école le savent, celle-ci est traversée ou est organisée autour de deux pôles et structurée autour de deux pôles qui ont configuré la place et le rapport au design graphique dans l'école. Le design graphique étant, dans cette école qui est d'abord une école de dessin, étant la discipline qui a longtemps été la discipline majeure. Non pas qu'elle ne le soit plus aujourd'hui, mais elle n'est plus seule à être la discipline majeure dans la mesure où il y a beaucoup d'autres secteurs. L'école et le design graphique ont longtemps été polarisés autour de ce qu'on appelait, de ce que représentaient deux noms de pays, de territoires, qui étaient les Suisses et les Polonais. C'est-à-dire d'un côté, pour le dire de façon extrêmement schématique, avec tous les inévitables raccourcis, mais en même temps les effets d'accentuation qu'implique le schématisme. D'un côté, un graphisme du détail, un graphisme de la forme. De l'autre côté, un graphisme qui est d'utilité sociale, comme un groupe s'est revendiqué, et un graphisme plutôt global, qui considère qu'il ne faut pas partir du détail, mais plutôt qui appréhender les choses d'un point de vue global. Aujourd'hui, et pour les mois qui viennent, à raison d'un mardi par mois, c'est de l'un des deux pôles de cette structure qu'il sera donc question, ce fameux pôle suisse. À l'initiative du Centre culturel suisse, et en particulier de Claire Hoffmann, qui est le curatrice et le responsable de la programmation et des arts visuels au Centre culturel suisse, qui est venu nous voir et à qui je laisserai le soin d'exposer les raisons pour lesquelles elle s'est tournée vers nous, non sans avoir préalablement salué et remercié chaleureusement à la fois André Baldinger et Philippe Millot, qui sont les concepteurs, les programmateurs de ce cycle de conférences ou d'interventions. C'est eux qui ont établi la liste des invités, avec l'un de nos invités qui sera Jost Oschuli, dont le choix a été fait en collaboration avec les éditions B42. Et non sans avoir remercié aussi toutes les équipes qui participent à l'organisation de ce cycle, Amélie Pauvert pour la communication à l'École des Arts Décoratifs, la régie, la technique et voilà, l'ensemble des participants. Et un tout dernier mot que j'aurais dû dire à un autre endroit, mais que je veux néanmoins le rappeler, il est frappant de constater combien ce clivage ou cette bipolarisation que j'évoquais entre les Suisses et les Polonais est présente dans l'exposition que vous avez peut-être vue au Musée des Arts Décoratifs sur les années 80, où vous avez 4 volets dans l'exposition, un volet mobilier, un volet le mode, un volet le nightclubbing avec les années Palace, et puis un volet le design graphique et paysage le visuel. Et on constate combien, en tout cas, la place de l'École des Arts Décoratifs a été importante dans la configuration du paysage visuel qui a émergé pendant ces années, et combien aussi cette polarité et cette polarisation était à l'œuvre. Voilà, merci. Et Claire, je t'en prie, quelques mots.
Merci beaucoup, Emmanuel. Je m'appelle Claire Hoffmann, je suis responsable des arts visuels au Centre culturel suisse. Et j'ai un grand plaisir d'initier ce cycle de conférences ce soir en coopération avec l'ENSAD, que je remercie vraiment chaleureusement pour cet accueil. Donc, depuis quelques mois, le Centre culturel suisse est fermé pour raison de travaux. Et donc pendant 2 ans, nous allons être nomades, nous allons faire un tour de France et en coopération avec différents partenaires, présenter la diversité de la production contemporaine suisse dans toutes les disciplines, c'est-à-dire des spectacles, des conférences, justement des expositions à Lyon, à Rennes, à Bordeaux, mais comme vous le voyez aussi un peu à Paris. Et donc dans ce cycle qui s'inscrit un peu dans notre tradition de focus sur le graphisme, vous avez aussi l'occasion de regarder un peu les conférences passées sur notre médiathèque qui nous sert d'archive. Et d'ailleurs, j'en profite aussi pour vous informer que aussi cette conférence et toutes les conférences seront en captation dans la médiathèque. Donc, si on rate quelque chose, si on a envie de revoir quelque chose, il y a toujours cette occasion et ça sera aussi présent sur le site de l'ENSAD. Donc en effet, quand il s'agissait de réfléchir où est-ce qu'on pourrait continuer ce cycle de graphisme, il me semblait logique d'aller là où les futurs graphistes sont formés. Et grâce à l'intérêt et le soutien qu'a porté Emmanuel Thiblou à ce projet, nous avons donc pu développer le programme avec André Baldinger et Philippe Millot. Et donc je ne vais pas vous donner tout le détail sur le cycle parce que c'est vraiment eux deux qui ont conçu aussi avec cette idée poétique que vous avez déjà pu voir avant que tout ça commence avec Fischli Weiss. Donc j'en profite juste pour remercier aussi de mon côté encore une fois l'ENSAD, Emmanuel Thiblou et toutes les 2 équipes du Centre culturel suisse et de l'ENSAD et surtout aussi ce bel échange autour de graphisme qu'on a eu André et Philippe qui commence ce soir.
Merci. Merci beaucoup d'être tous ici. On a aussi beaucoup de plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui en première conférence GTF, Graphic Facility. Et peut-être un petit mot un peu sur les lignes qui nous ont guidés dans la programmation de ce cycle.
Bon, Emmanuel vous a dit 2-3 mots sur le design graphique, son histoire à l'école, etc. Bon. Lorsque le Centre culturel suisse, lorsque Claire est venue nous voir et nous a proposé de travailler, d'essayer d'imaginer quelque chose, forcément, on a dû se poser la question, quelle idée a-t-on de la Suisse ? Bon. Quelle idée a-t-on, nous, André ou moi, c'est pas déjà la même chose, et puis quelle idée pourraient avoir les invités qui viendraient pendant ce cycle de conférences. On s'est dit au fond qu'un des intérêts, ce serait de voyager en Suisse, de faire un petit voyage. Alors à tout seigneur, tout honneur, on s'est dit il faut commencer par Londres. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a invité GTF pour commencer. Et puis on s'est dit, bon, au fond, il y a chez GTF ce qu'on va peut-être retrouver chez d'autres invités, quelque chose d'un peu particulier que Armin Hoffman, dont vous connaissez peut-être le livre, enfin, The Graphic Design Manual d'Armin Hoffman. Et dans ce livre, Armin Hoffman dit une chose qui passe un peu inaperçue, comme ça, parce que ça a l'air si simple, qui est de dire que finalement, dans son travail, dans n'importe quel travail, toute part expérimentale comporte une part d'application. Et tout travail appliqué comporte une part expérimentale. Ça a l'air bête, en fait, quand on le dit comme ça, mais au fond, quand on regarde le film de Fischli et Weiss, là, qui se projetait pendant que vous vous installiez, on retrouve, en fait, cette chose-là. Cette espèce d'effort surdimensionné dans la précision. Enfin, je veux dire, Fischli et Weiss, ils mettent en œuvre une précision folle. C'est-à-dire, finalement, ils sont très appliqués à ce qu'ils font. Et en même temps, on ne peut pas s'empêcher de penser que tout ça est un peu fou, enfin, je veux dire, un peu absurde, de s'appliquer autant pour expérimenter quelque chose. C'est-à-dire pour ne même pas savoir véritablement quel va être le résultat de son application. Et au fond, on s'est dit que c'était un peu le fil conducteur de nos invitations. C'est-à-dire inviter des gens qui se trouvent toujours à cet endroit-là. qui sont dans ce qu'on a appelé un déséquilibre précis. Voilà.
Bon, pour nous, ce constat de Armin Hofmann, c'était aussi parce qu'il a une dimension universelle et il est bien au-delà des différentes positions des écoles, peu importe de quelle nationalité on parle. Et c'est pour ça aussi que c'est un peu les invités, ils correspondent tous un peu à cette leitmotiv. Et c'est ça qui nous a guidés dans la programmation. Alors, je vous présente rapidement JTF. JTF a été fondé à Londres en 1990 par Paul Neale et Andrew Stevens, les deux étaient rejoints très rapidement par Huw Morgan. Et les trois se partagent et co-dirigent depuis ce studio ensemble. Et ces trois-là ont aussi toujours gardé les mains très proches des projets. Ça veut dire c'est pas eux qui commencent à être art directeurs, ils sont vraiment au plus proche des projets qui ont lieu dans tout le quotidien. Leur approche est très souvent considérée comme originale, tout en travaillant avec une certaine clarté et simplicité. Mais une dimension qu'ils essaient d'intégrer, c'est toujours aussi avec une délicate balance, avec un côté un peu plus émotionnel dans l'expression qu'ils donnent à leur travail. Le genre de travail était très rapidement dépassé les deux dimensions. Ils ont se consacré aussi à l'espace et travaillent souvent avec des matériaux et des procédés non standards et des savoir-faire qui sont des fois des techniques anciennes ou des procédures de niche qui leur permettent aussi de se distinguer avec la création des autres. Leur création, leurs conférences et leurs expositions sont internationalement vues et exercées. Et voilà, I donne you the parole, Paul and Huw and Andrew, please, the public is yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. So just for the sake of clarity, Andy Stevens, Huw Morgan. And firstly, thank you. I hear there's a train strike tonight, so it's really appreciated that people have actually got here. I think a lot of the background about Graphic Thought Facility was said, so I'll skip that a little bit and I guess go straight into maybe the reason why we're here. One of the first things we looked at was the title. That was a translation, English translation, by one of our senior designers at GTF, French speaker, a precise imbalance, which I hope is right. It's interesting, actually, even the translation maybe is somehow a precise imbalance. I think when Andre first asked us to come and speak here, referenced the project, which he thought there was a lot of resonance in, sort of essence of Swiss design. And I think we were quite surprised. But actually, when you look at the title there, there's a lot in that title that I think is resonant in the work we do. That idea, that contrast, that kind of conflict you get between, maybe even a sweet spot you get between something that is very refined and ordered and something that has an opportunity to be chaotic or messy or playful. Oddly, we've always had a lot of connection with Switzerland, be it through teaching or clients, or we like Helvetica, that's a good start. Chocolate as well, that's good. And actually also really importantly through people working at the studio. We've always oddly attracted a lot of Swiss students, and we've often been attracted to Swiss students and actually European students as well, because there is a sort of rigor and a discipline that maybe you find less in a British educational system.
Yeah, we had a terrible education in that sense. You know, in some ways it's free and wild and you can do amazing things in British art schools. So we perhaps had a very cliched idea of what Swiss design was and still learning. So actually in the mid-90s, when the eminent Mr. Cornel Windlin called the studio and said, I've got a student in Zurich, he'd love to come to London, can he come and work with you for the summer? We were like, brilliant, we've got a really big catalogue to do, he'll be so Swiss. And you can't believe how disappointed we were to receive the beautiful and wonderful human being Marco Valser, who went on to found Electrosmog, eSmog with Valley. And so, you know, that was really our introduction to sitting down and chatting at length with a Swiss designer, and found out they weren't very Swiss at all. And that beautiful bag, you know, for the Migros bag, again, it seems so concurrent with the way we're thinking about finding joy in things that are out there and less about creating formal movements, almost with work.
Yeah. So I guess through this talk, the way we've structured it, I think it was said in the introduction, there's 32 years of work behind us. We're a relatively small studio, but we've had, very fortunately, quite a high output of work and types of work, which is very broad-ranging, from publication and print to identity through to environmental and physical design. So the selection of work we've chosen here is effectively 4 projects with a sort of little scattering of other ideas and thoughts and project that from other projects that prompt other ideas. And really, I guess they are a starting point for thinking about the areas and the things that we're interested in, and the kind of commonality between those things. And really, they're kind of prompts for, I guess, those thoughts. So the first project, going back in time, 23 years now, the project that Andre referenced when we spoke to him, the Royal College of Art prospectus.
So yeah, this, by prospectus as a translation, you know, it's the book you used to write off for when you wanted to apply to art school. I guess it's mostly online now, but you used to get this piece of print through the post. And it was exciting to be asked to do this. It felt like an affirmation to go back and do an important job for your old school. Now I look back at it, I also think it had a little to do, also something to do with the fact we were probably very cheap. You know, we were quite young, so they could take a risk. But we maybe got to do it because the year before we'd been asked to work with the college on their exhibition celebrating 100 years of being the Royal College of Art. And this was along with another designer, Russell Warren Fisher, and myself and Paul came back to work on this. And Huw, you were a student then.
Yeah, I was just, I'm a little younger than Andy and Paul. And I was a student there, and I was invited very fortuitously to be part of this, I guess, as a student there who could contribute an original piece that related to the project.
Yeah, someone who's on the ground.
Someone, yeah, exactly.
Not oldsters like us who were 6 years
kind of one of the
college.
people, yeah.
And so this is a project we did for that. And one thing we found out is the Royal College had a terrible archive. You know, it was just the same old 35mm slides that we used again and again for publicity. And there was very little else to work with. So, you know, in that sense, we took the slides and we found the bit of joy in all their surrounds and bad markings. The librarians were furious, I think, with us because it made them look badly organised.
So sloppy.
And so, yeah, it was a resourcefulness. It was finding something with what we had. Interesting, I would say this is very un-Swiss, probably more French. I think there's a bit of grapou in here when I look at this piece, who we were fans of. We were big fans of. So we got the gig again to do the prospectus, and there were some rules and frameworks we had to work with. One was we had to stay within the exact same budget as the prospectus the previous year, and the prospectus the previous year we were not fans of. It was A4. It was in different CMYK printing on cheap glossy paper, and it was like, but there was no more money to go beyond that. So we had to find another way in. And a lot of that cost was probably trying to do CMYK print to reproduce these awful old transparencies. And we didn't want to go and wrestle Grappu again with that. They were already doing that better than we were. And we were in the library looking for resource, and we found a filing cabinet with all these press cuttings, which again is a very old term. So before social media, a PR company would be paid by a business, or this sense of school, to look for any article published in a magazine or newspaper and cut it out and send it to the school as a record. And so we found bundles of this stuff that no one looked at. It just kept arriving at the school and no one looked at it. But it was a free resource. And fantastically, it was a black and white resource. And we managed to sell in this idea then that rather than use the work that had been captured years before, we could use work that was in print now. And so it had a certain glamour and excitement that students' work was out there. I mean, you know, parents might have said to their kids, why, you know, not understand why they would want to go to art school, but actually if you might get your work in the Sunday newspaper next to the football scores, then that's real work and real design. But what was even better than this, you might get to produce a stamp and you can send your grandma a card with your stamp on it. You know, that's really making it. But because there was lots of these files, it also solved another problem we've dealt with a lot, which is the politics of an institution. Maybe I don't know. But, you know, each head of department had a very clear idea of what to them represented their department, and maybe why the same pictures used to get used again and again. But this way, because then to us one photocopy looked like another, we could give them a choice and they pick one. So they had a sense of control, and it allowed us to move on.
There's a few through this project, actually, a reminder to myself to turn off my email. Apologies if it keeps going off in the background. There's a few projects in here that we've scattered through, which we're not going to delve into, but they relate, and we'll come back to the crux of the project we're talking about. This was a really formative time. We used to work a lot with a company called Habitat, Terence Conran founded in the 60s. And we used to do a lot of work for the press department. And a lot of the time we were trying to work with limited budgets or trying to do more than we could with what we had. Every season they would produce a season of product that would have a theme or a name. And I think this one is particularly relevant, being called Basic Deluxe, because it has that contrast and that tension in the name. But I think it's also interesting because, unfortunately, I didn't drop the picture in of us doing this, but this is a kind of exercise in trying to make grandeur out of nothing, the very simplicity of taking a mirror and making something multiply up. So this was late 90s, I guess we were doing this in this period. And there's a whole series of these we did. So at one point we did there was a series of products that they had produced that were based on Villenois. We couldn't afford to go there, so we made it all in cardboard and made it very, very purposefully raw, and then had all the product superimposed as renders. So I think there's a few of these dropping through as we go through, but it's kind of nice references back, I think, to some of the earlier work.
And that we did print in colour now and then.
And we did print in colour, exactly.
And so having got to a solution that could be black and white, we could have a nice uncoated paper, which seemed, you know, wild to us. And it could be not A4, and we could use a special spot colour. And all we had to do was find a really good photocopier to photocopy them. And then, you know, I think here in sense of the typography was us trying to make this look a little bit grown up, that countered the roughness that was going on. Yeah,
there. So almost had this counterpoint of almost this Futura Maxi, which has got this kind of counterpoint, almost kind of corporate. But I think even in the grid there's this, you're playing with this tension of something that's very, very straight on the bottom edge with a kind of ragging on top. So you've got none of those kind of spaces being made through the headers.
And, you know, they let us play. So there was one section in the middle of colour, and they said it's really important that you make a big thing of how our students get jobs. This is what sells the college. And one of the joys of this project was we found a young illustration graduate at Cam Tang, and he could do amazing stuff. He was working both in line art, rotary pens and ink, and just beginning to work with computers too. And we liked that mix. It was good. So for this, you know, Cam, I think, deduced that the kids who might be applying at this part in the late 90s probably played with Tamagotchis a bit earlier, and they would really like Tamagotchis. And so Tamagotchi graph of success, which is, I said, kind of meaningful decoration for this place.
I remember that almost broke the printer's computer. Could hardly cope with it at the time.
And other little things thrown in. So the fact that the map had to work. Students used to turn up with big folios for interviews, and the map had been drawn reasonably well the year before, so we just photocopied last year's map. But instead, we didn't have any colour, so we had to put arrows on instead. But it kind of worked fine. And then, you know, the idea that going to the Royal College of Art was some kind of big deal. And at your graduation ceremony, it wouldn't just be, here you go, thank you. You would be at the Royal Albert Hall, and your success would be beamed to the stars and around the world. And trumpeters in golden uniforms would be playing music as you came on the stage. And the ones who were around the Queen's funeral, the same ones. And we really wanted the trumpeters here to be gold foil, but the collective the collective hierarchy of the college were like, go away. You know, we're not spending money in the middle of a book on your gold foil. So, you know, fair enough. But actually, years later, when you're not dealing with a committee, this was a book for Charles Saatchi. We tried it again, where we said, can we have the cover in the middle of the book and put foil on it, because we want to start with your picture on the front that you really love. And he went, fine. So great, we could do it. So Cam set to work, and this was a lovely bit of the brief. The other part about the college, and I think it's lovely to be back in a college like this, is it's not the glamour of the chairs or the rooms or the space. It's the intangible togetherness of different disciplines working in a place that makes a college alive and creates new opportunities. And essentially, we set that brief to Cam, and he started these incredible drawings where jewelry and photography would merge, or automotive design and weaving would merge. And he just began drawing and drawing and drawing. And this is all done manually. And you see at the bottom, that's where each morning he's getting his pen to work again. So he created this beautiful world of collaboration, and that's what it felt like to be there and you know, make use of it. I don't think we did enough, but make use of it while you're here. It's hilarious because some of these things are very modern computer connections there. SCART with chairs.
All hand-drawn, these ones are all hand-drawn.
So that continuity with Cam has
it's kind of carried on, really. I mean, Cam, we use illustration quite a lot. I did read at one point that Swiss designers prefer photography over illustration. So I don't know whether that counts us out of this game, but we carried on using Cam a lot in projects. Design Museum was a project that came a little after the prospectus. I forget the date, 2003 or 4, something like that.
Ancient past.
And it's interesting. It's an interesting one because, in a way, the precursor to that was, as Andy says, this kind of world that he created that touched on isms. So it touched on movements, or it touched on physical things, like Andy said, automotive design mixed with ceramics, mixed with communication, mixed with product design. But the idea for the Design Museum was, a starting point for the Design Museum was actually, can we use illustration to suggest these things, imply them, but not actually fully kind of articulate them? This really, I guess the solution from this, the crux of the solution from this is really in the brief, which came from Alice Rawthorne, who was then the head of, creative director, I guess, of the Design Museum at the time.
She kind of became she was the first female, I guess, kind of, chair leader.
And the brief for this was to create an identity that would only last for a period of time. Illustration isn't something that we would lean to as a branding tool for that reason, for its ability to kind of expire, really. But this was a really beautiful opportunity to do something that was super rich, but was ephemeral.
Yeah, I think she was very wise in that. And again, maybe, you know, rightly so, pushing back on that idea of what things like design museum look like they're about a pared down purity that would never change and was for all time. And in some ways, you know, it was a very male kind of driven sense, maybe even, you know, in the English Design Museum.
Yeah.
And she was
and also interpretations of what design were, I guess.
Yeah, and she was the director who said, no, we can have, you know, a milliner in Philip Tracy in his hats. We can talk about interiors as being massively important, and it's not about engines and, you know, big type and things. And so she was kind of in a way pushing back and saying, I know as soon as I leave, whoever comes in will change it, so let's not build something forever.
Oddly, the type mark has remained.
Yeah, that was really weird. Because the type we did for this was just there to balance the stuff, and then the stuff disappeared and the type stayed, which is.
And when you've got an approach to identity that's so reverent, you can start doing fun things. And actually, this was part of a design prize called Designers of the Year, which was a sort of extrapolation of what we were doing with the identity. But I guess it also fulfilled our interest, not only in response to the design museum as a space, but our interest in physicality and making things.
This was made in, I remember it being made in California.
Yeah, it's made in California. We found a guy who could, could make. So the name's completely gone.
A mobile.
Mobiles. We since find out it's incredibly hard to make. It's incredibly hard to balance a mobile. Never to be found again.
Yeah, like the Lauf der Linge, never to be done again.
Never to be done again. Yeah. Pragmatic joy. I guess one thing which is really important to the way we work is being pragmatic, and pragmatism comes in many forms. It can be about being realistic about a schedule or a budget. It can be realistic about how you can deal with content, as you'd find in the Royal College Royal College catalogue. This is a project. This next project is kind of interesting comparison when you put it next to Royal College. Royal College is an old project that dealt with new stuff. This is a kind of newish project that deals with older stuff. This is a book for a stately home in the UK called Chatsworth. The book was called Chatsworth Arcadia Now. It's a 500-page book that tells the history of Chatsworth through 7 periods of its life. And it's interesting, I think, in lots of ways. It's interesting because in some ways it's quite a sort of straight book. Chatsworth, a little bit of background about Chatsworth. Chatsworth is set up in the heart of England, in the Derbyshire Dales, and has been home to the same family for 16 generations since 1569. It's a very unusual place. It's an unusual place for a lot of reasons. It's unusual for a stately home like that to survive. Mostly these places are too expensive to run, too expensive to heat, and they just either go into turn into other kind of uses, or they get handed over to institutions to be turned into kind of museum pieces. So that's the first thing. They've managed to make it survive, and they've managed to make it pay. And it's also kind of strange because they still live this extraordinary anachronistic lifestyle. I stayed there when we first did the project, and it took me 3.5 minutes to get from my bedroom to the place where we had breakfast, which you can get quite far in 3.5 minutes. It's down the stairs, through the thing, you say hello to the maid as you go through, and eventually you get to this huge space, and your breakfast is revealed on a platter, a silver platter. what's, I think, what it's particularly known for is that it has this incredible collection of arts and crafts, furniture, paintings, old master drawings, modernist works, sculptures from neoclassicism to contemporary, and books. It's incredibly vast. It's both arts and it's decorative. And you get this, when you go around there, it's, in one hand, it could be perceived as something that is very formal and is very kind of respectable. But when you go there, you get this extraordinary mashup of things. So you'll have a Hockney next to Howard Hodgkin, or you'll have an antiquated book next to a Fabergé snuff box, or you'll have a Rembrandt next to a Michael Craig Martin. You have all of these things in one place. So actually, and this is what really interested us to the project, and I guess this is the kind of the mischief in the way that we like to think about things. In one hand, when we could have approached it in a very formal way, but that's kind of like how it's always approached. What was actually really interesting was that this place was very dynamic. It was a place of constant change and constant flux. It's not a historic piece in the sense of a museum. It is a family home. So things can kind of change.
Is it not the case, because I'm not so sure, and you were there, that actually there were a lot of this is not always front of house? So no, if you go and tour the house, you might not see this. A lot of this art is kind of in the family home.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I guess, the second thing that really appealed to us, is that we had the opportunity to go back a house. So the actual home itself has 126 rooms, of which 26 are front-facing, and the rest belong to the family. So it's kind of strange. It's kind of a weird setup, really. Very British institution, but one that's actually, even within Britain, fairly unique. And we were offered sort of unfettered access to everywhere. So how do you deal with it? You had this odd mix between conventional and unconventional, and actually those clash of two things in itself was kind of not formal and not staid and old-fashioned. It was, in an odd kind of way, quite contemporary. So the book itself is, in many ways, structured in a very simple way. I think you'll see, or we'll talk a number of times about structure and how we then sprinkle in the sort of lack of structure on top of that, and how these two things have this kind of tension between the two. The book really was a photographic portrait in one hand, split with 7 essays. So the essays fractured the portrait, the image section, in a very consistent way, and acted as a sort of steadying influence to the photography, which we wanted to do in a very informal, candid way. If you go to the house, it's completely crazy. Like I said, you see this sort of cacophony of texture and pattern and influences and crafts and arts. And actually, as a visitor experiencing it, yes, there is a formality in some ways, because you go through, there are places that are roped off and there are places that are hidden. But actually, at the end of the day, it's still a family home, and it still has some degree of informality of a family home. It's just that instead of dusting around, the newspapers and the kids' drawings, you're dusting around these kind of precious artifacts. So we wanted to try and capture that level of candidness. It's almost, I guess, an iPhone generation. So that was the first thing, trying to capture that sort of spirit in the house, rather than it all being having this sort of formal kind of bent.
Maybe that slight irreverence as well, isn't it? Because I think all the books, and there's many books on Chatsworth, but they're about, like say, look at, bow before the splendour of, it's kind of formalness of treasure. Everything had to be revered, whereas actually when you're in their back of house, things are there quite casually.
Well, I think even in front of house, there's a sort of casualness to it. I mean, there's casualness just by virtue of the fact that there's tons of it. The fact that you can have, this mishmash, this mashup different periods and different times, I think is kind of interesting. So it has got this candidness, but also, and this really goes back to this idea that I guess the solution is almost always in the problem. And one of the problems we had is that, in one hand, it's a kind of such a mix of sort of feels in this building. On one hand, it's very beautifully lit. So you have moments where the internal space is, which we'll come to in a moment, the internal space is very beautifully lit. And there are other places that are incredibly dark. So how do you light those? Do you just bring in a film crew or lighting crew to actually light those perfectly? But then you start losing that candidness. You start losing that kind of spirit and that spontaneity, which is what you get when you go around the house. We'll come back to this, but this is a little bit about how we structured it. So it was a photo story that was then split by a series of essays. So how do you catch that spirit? So we worked with a photographer, Victoria Healy Hutchins, English but New York based, who has a great ability to kind of capture a spirit. And the things we were kind of interested in looking at were a number of elements. One were odd juxtapositions, this kind of clash between old and new. Jeremy Deller next to an 18th century wine cooler, or the fact that you would in some places you'd have grandeur and naturally sort of beautifully lit areas. In other places they were dark and dingy. Back a house. I was going to say it had a modesty back a house, but it's not many houses have chandeliers, I guess. But the fact that you'd go around go up a back stairwell and you'd find 3 Michael Craig Martins, but they were not lit. So how do you light that? Okay, so flash can be a way to give an immediacy and a kind of oddness between natural light and something that was lit. The fact that a Rembrandt might have something in front of it, then let it be. You don't have to clear it up because that's the spirit you have there. Or the fact that you can handle these precious artifacts, Hockney on the left, Rembrandt on the right, in an informal way, be it through the fact that they were literally carried around and moved and the spaces were reinvented, or that they were dark spaces, so you had to light them some way, so why not use the rawness of flash?
I guess there's like with the RCA book, where you're just trying to catch an intangible, which is the spirit of a school. Then here, using your juxtaposition to get an intangible. Yeah, intangible
spirit, exactly, without trying to clear the way. Or how do you deal with reflections? Well, you can spend hours. We do a lot of work with artists. We spend hours of time trying to get rid of reflections. Well, why not keep them? Because that's the spirit of it. And actually what's reflecting is this beautiful courtyard in the background. And that's part of the spirit of it. Or a nod or a reference back to the way pictures have moved around the space. Or scale. The fact that you're dealing with very small things, very intimate things, or much more larger, more sculptural things. And then finally, pattern. Really important. There's pattern everywhere. We wanted to make this book dense. We wanted to make this book feel like a little chunk, a little miniature of the house. And the fact that you could bring these clashing patterns together where it's kind of forgiving and unforgiving at the same time was really part of the spirit of it.
I think it might upset a lot of people who want a book on Chatsworth.
I think it possibly, maybe. Yeah. I think it maybe upset people who have an idea of what Chatsworth would be. But I guess one of the parts of the brief and why we took it on is that Chatsworth, and this came from the house, they wanted something about nowness. And if you do something about nowness, it's an odd balance to make. When you do something about nowness, when you have historical content, when not all the content is historical, then actually you almost can flip it the other way, and I don't know.
And a lot of people have a certain view of the place. Chatsworth, where Huw says located in the Derbyshire Dales, is, I'm from Sheffield, industrial city on its kind of northern border, and you grew up around in Stafford Stoke, which is the industrial city on its western border, and it's where you would go for a day trip with your granny and have a picnic. Or
It's exactly, and I think the challenge of that was exciting. I think the ambition of that was exciting, and I guess it gave us within the sort of thinking for us was to be able to give this absolute structure. So in many ways, the typography and the typesetting is very, very straight. And every item is captioned, so it has a band that runs through the whole structure of the book. But within that little tiny canvas, things can happen. Within that, like any book, this book is a sum of parts. And finding ways to, say, divide an essay section here, we created, again, it was playing on the theme of pattern. We're using a kaleidoscope to create sort of evocative images from around the space. And what we wanted to do, I guess the cover, and I guess it was again credit to the publishers for not being pushed to have a title on the cover and to be able to use it all on the spine. It was creating a little, I guess doll's house version of Chatsworth House. As an aside, I guess one of the ways we work is that you're looking for reference, or you're looking for clues into things, ways into things. And this was a book that we found in the library. They have a very extensive library at Chatsworth by the English printer Joseph Moxon from 1700s. He's produced one of the very first books on printing, but previous to this, he published this book, which is a kind of a workman's book, which I think they said it was useful for writing masters, painters, carvers and masons and other lovers of curiosity. So we can add graphic designers to that. And that was used to create a title piece, title pages, and a spine for the piece.
We're told the Swiss like asymmetry, but I think we do like asymmetry, but we also like the symmetry as well. Yeah. All the symmetries.
All the symmetries. And then I guess back to Cam Tang again. The essays were all preceded by a contemporary take on an illuminated character, which all came together to form the cover lining, to cover an emboss on the cover lining. The serpent, which is part of the Devonshire crest, being the linking factor between all the elements. So Cam keeps coming back, and there's lots of sort of friends and acquaintances and work colleagues that are a constant in GTF's life. I think everyone needs a bit of luck in the world, particularly this industry, and we've been very lucky to meet people and to have, I guess, chance meetings, which in some ways reflect some of the chance that we use in some of our work.
Yeah, and these, I guess the projects we'll go through today, none of them are currently on our website. Our website is a thing that needs some love in terms of time given to it, but it's alive. But this one is, and this we made in 2000 and do you know when? Yeah, you can read it there. I can't see. Yeah, so a long time ago. And this at the time was every job we'd ever done to that point, like really crappy little jobs or our favorite jobs, a voucher for somebody. And it trailed it. Everything was given the same. It's just chronological. Everything's given the same weighting, so good jobs and bad jobs, but it's just by connections and how we got to do those jobs and who we work with. It's interesting. There's thoughts to, what if we took this on again? But it would be, I think its real size would be as big as this screen that would go on.
We've done a rough sketch of it now,
but
I think it's 6 times the size almost, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think something that's not unique to ourselves, and I think, when we chat about what we see as actual Swiss design, and that was through with Marco rather than what we perceived it as, that idea of creating an underlying order that then chance and joy and playfulness can behave in, I think is you know, possibly quite a typical approach, but it's a lovely feeling when that can pan out and work.
To which I guess there's a number of projects where we've used, I guess, randomness or chance, or try to use randomness and chance to create kind of an opportunity, really. Two very small projects. Art of the Typewriter. This is actually a project that was published in 2015, but 2 years ago we did a 40th edition version of it. Originally, using digital printing, it had a series of covers and back covers that were randomized in terms of what you got. So there was some degree of randomness. When we came to do the 40th book version, sorry, the 40th anniversary version, which was effectively a slip cover that went on the front, technology maybe had come on a bit, and we created an algorithm with a partner, Johannes, I forget Johannes' second name, in order to be able to create a series of slip covers, all of which were different. So this typewriter ribbon, the theme of the book, I should say, is a collection from the Sackler, no, not the Sackler, the Hoffman, no, the Sackner archive. It's a collection of visual, of sort of typewriter art, effectively, concrete poetry and typewriter art. So the typewriter ribbon played a part in the original design. It was a ribbon that laid inside as part of the original book. And so the graphic version became this random part. And another client, Vitra, who we worked for extensively over the last 15 years, a brochure which is not so interesting internally, but as a way to articulate their offer of bespoke product, we created, again, an algorithm that used color and paint to create 50,000 unique covers. An identity that uses chance, Photo London. So Photo London is an art fair, photography fair, which was started about 6 years ago, I guess as a kind of competitor to Photo Paris Photo, and is now a kind of, I guess, not of the same league, but that was the kind of intent. Held in Somerset House, which is a large Georgian property based on the Strand in London. We've done a lot of work with artists in the past. I guess most notably for us, a significant project was Frieze London, the art fair that started now nearly 20 years ago. We set up the original branding and the original campaigns for that. Wayfinding, wayfinding, the original identity for that. And it's always a tricky, group shows are really hard because it's like, where do you begin? When we first started Frieze, there was no, at that point, art fair that was using photography. That's the first thing that we were kind of intrigued with. How can we use photography to embellish or to promote an art fair? And the second thing is, how do we deal with this when we want to avoid a hero image, which is, I guess, we're trying to do. You know, it's a collection of works. It's very hard to pull one to the fore.
It's also going to say back to the politics, like the RCA book, where it's, you know, to put one artist represented by a certain gallery as a lead for an art fair is a bit tricky. Everyone else is going to get upset. So you are looking for maybe metaphor or another way in. And I guess the way in here was just the park. This tent just appears in the same place in the Regent's Park in London every year. So we always captured the park between the fairs. Yeah.
So year on year, we'd find a different take to interpret the park, be it illuminating trees. In the 10th anniversary year, we did daylight fireworks, using a drone before drones were really known.
Yeah, it was a small helicopter.
It was a small helicopter, yeah. We were really pleased with that until about 5 years ago when drones became ubiquitous. And the kaleidoscope, which, you know, I think it's not so normal for us to reference one work to another, but the kaleidoscope, already a theme that you've seen in the Chatsworth book. Photo London, in a way, is the same problem. It's a group show. How do you deal with, like Andy said, how do you deal with the politics? How do you deal with the theme of photography, which I guess is so aligned with communications of anything really, I guess. It's really important to say, to start off with, that's not our graphics up there. Okay, this is the starting point of a brief. So this is, I guess, a lesson in how do you bypass something you don't want to kind of deal with, and that's a logo which A, you think is strategically wrong. They don't need a logo, and B, you may be formally not so keen on. So we started by thinking of how do we create a set of images that can be used in much in the way that we did in Freeze, that can have a direct link back to photography, but are generic enough to sort of represent the whole body of photography. So we started looking at, going analog, we started looking at photograms, taking the mark, this L and this half moon, which kind of made an L and a P, and splitting them up, and getting it into a dark room and creating photograms. There's a heritage of photograms. I think we just recently, previous to this, completed a book for Thomas Ruff, who was doing actually incredible things with photograms in 3 dimensions, in digital 3 dimensions. But of course, its heritage is much older than that. So it's, I don't know, it's a little bit like neon lights. The reoccurring of one process keeps coming back. It felt like it was a sort of timeless process to sort of work with, and an opportunity to mark make. So we made hundreds of this mark making using in the photo studio, making these components. And we actually ended up making, does that play for us? Yeah, it does. We ended up making little short films. And we made short films actually in part because we knew we were going to be potentially have the opportunity to use them on site in the venue as a way to flag post the various entrances. The place where this happens, Photo London, a place called Somerset House, is a very awkward building. It's not conducive actually to being an art gallery, an art space, and it has a lot of entrances. But so we started making these animations where you'd have pieces that would collide.
I was interesting also thinking back to the Design Museum, that no one would be able to remember the shapes in the Design Museum logo. It just became a series of assets that could take over a space. And similar here, it's recognizable without it being an idea. It's
about
not
it being
boiled
something
down, reductive.
Yeah, it's more of a feel and having a sort of strength in continuity. So out of these videos, we were able to create screenshots effectively, little sort of moments. So how do you deal with the color? Well, the color's kind of useful in a way, because colors can change. We used to do use a similar device in Freeze where we wouldn't have a corporate color, and I think it's probably a natural bent to push against things being absolutely consistent, but still get the heart and the spirit of consistency. So it's more about the attitude changing rather than having to, the attitude being consistent rather than the parts being absolutely consistent. So these kind of moments in time, these little bits of randomness, this kind of mood, just became very simple backdrops for publicity. So newspaper magazines, newspaper advertisements, magazines advertisements, invites, VIP cards. It was a resource, really. It was a way of making content.
Unlike the, I guess, a daguerreotype, cyanotype, there's that history of these processes just being able to shift through that color depending on the technology of the time as well.
Yeah. The typography, I don't dwell massively on the typography, but a kind of an aside. There's a set of books in the UK called Ladybird. I mean, the mark itself, we felt had a real kind of Britishness to it. And we had at the time was an intern, Aurelia, who was working at our studio, found these books and started working up the typeface.
Really, it's from Leipzig, yeah?
From Leipzig, yeah. And started working up the typeface and eventually developed it into a working typeface. I think we actually ended up convincing her to create a bolder weight. And that became the basis of the mark, which then became the basis of typographic language, which could be the voice of Photo London throughout. So it's, I guess, that thing of referencing, it's not an overt, no one's going to kind of get that, but I think it's two things. One, I think we like it anecdotally, but there is also something about the feel. Sometimes things just feel right because they're deep within a psyche. And year on year, we could develop it. We could develop it through the way the forms were made or the way colours worked. And each year it worked in exactly the same attitude. It was just a mark hard on top of these elements. And then you could go off-piste a little bit. You could start bringing other colorways. So suddenly you had to denote the difference between, say, two types of invite. So these little marks could become almost kind of fault lines in the original pieces.
Yeah, it's nice. Like these are referencing, as it were, an emotive history or cliche of photography in a different way.
Yeah, it's not unusual for us to work on a project and then the project extend into other applications, i.e. a branding project may turn into an environmental project. It may turn into a wayfinding project. This is the wayfinding element to Photo London, which again I think it encapsulates a lot of the way we work. I think one is materiality, is how materiality can evoke something, and two, I guess it's pragmatism. So this was a signage system that worked all the way around Somerset House, and it was made by a maker of portfolios, of boxes effectively. So one, it allowed us to reference, I guess, two things. One, that little bit of kind of analog photography where you have that sort of texture and materiality. And the second was this anodized section, this plate, which worked very simply with vinyl cut type, could be done very cheaply, very economically.
Good down long corridors, you need to see the end. The front of the sign almost means less. You only see that when you get up to it. Yeah.
So I guess there was two things, as Andy said. One is, again, it's working very pragmatically, trying to find the solution in the problem. Very narrow corridors, you can really only see down them. So how do you deal with that? Okay, so you deal with end pieces. You see the ends of them and they become the prominent thing. The other thing is it's a listed building. So how do you fix something? How do you fix something to a wall? Well, firstly, you make sure it's light. You make sure it doesn't need many fixings. The second thing is how do you make it cheap? Okay, so you've got to find a process or a method of making that is either can be mechanized or uses materials that are inexpensive. Box making, relatively cheap. Part of a process that can be produced relatively quickly, relatively cheaply, and also, I guess, in recognition of things being disposable, they have to last for a short amount of time, but they also have to look smart. You're selling expensive, product, so they've kind of got to look sort of purposeful. So the idea, I guess, of using materiality is something that, as a way to sort of prompt an emotion or a feel, however slight it is something that reoccurs quite a lot in our work.
Yes, I think, I remember being at the Royal College, and you may have the same thing here. We had an incredible materials library that, in essence, wasn't ever meant for graphic designers to go into. It's where automotive designers or jewelers would go in and look at specific things. But actually, to wander in there as graphic designers, you realize you looked at these materials and they just evoked so much feeling in terms of what they, it made it feel institutional or made it feel futuristic. And I think that idea of the materiality being a really intrinsic part of graphic design is something that flows through our outcomes. Yeah, so this is a group show for the Gagosian Gallery. So we do a lot of catalogues, mostly monographs of particular artists' works and shows, which can have subtle beauty, but the big thing about them is beautiful reproduction of the work and that the mood is subtly right, but it's all geared towards supporting one artist. The times we get to play more widely for the Gagosian is when it's a group show, and it's that same problem we talked about. You're not necessarily picking one artist to be on the front, so let's create a piece around this. So the curators of the show had named this crash after the books of J.G. Ballard, or the book of J.G. Ballard, you know, quite disturbing book, quite, you know...
So it's semi-erotic kind of,
fetish, you know, fetishization, and the fact that they were saying, here we're putting together a group of artists who've perhaps referenced that dystopian view of the world. And I can't remember where we found the images, if they're in public things, but these photographs are actually of the car that Ballard was in a crash in. And I think, you know, partly led to the creation of the book, or in writing the novel. So he was in this quite serious car accident, and these are photographs taken by him for fun or insurance purposes, I don't know, but they're in there. But the car it is a Ford Zephyr, you know, a big car of the 1970s, and I think being of an age, when we grew up in that age, they were cars with plastic seats that got hot, and you remembered those plastic seats all your life. But they were made to look like leather by the welding in them. And we found the companies who could make the welding. That, you know, every time there's a plastic binder of A4 paper of bank files on a shelf, it's using this heat welding technique to make it bend, and there's sponge in between that melts and holds the sides together. And I think in a quite typical way, we could use that process but see where it could go. So once you've make the outer plastic clear and not a colour, you start looking at what's inside. You can make that foam, it could be white, but here it's kind of a flesh pink, and it's bound with this kind of surgical steel Japanese ready-made binders. So it's, again, it's about a mood. It's got this, you know, slightly prosthetic limb oddness that's there to carry the photograph of this crash, of this moment. So yeah, that is a way in, and we got. Look, now we've been given the go-ahead to use foil inside. We've no stopping. We were off.
So the car reference in the typography running through.
Yes, that used to be on a Ford. Was it like on a Ford Sierra?
Ford Sierra.
Yeah, that it looked so modern and 80s.
So the chapter numbers running through it.
Yeah. And then. So that's, in a way, using that materiality again for a particular mood. But I think as you'd reference possibly with the Photo London, there's a way you can build up a series of a palette of materials that in a way becomes the identity, the mood itself. And so this project is maybe about three. Yeah. And actually, if you jump on the train to London and get out at St. Pancras and face directly south towards London, the building you'll see is this building. So it's this photograph is taken from St. Pancras, the Gardenor of London. And it used to be the bit below, not the top bit, it used to be the 1970s modern extension to Camden Town Hall. Camden is the local government of that area of London. And big money's pouring into this area now, and they've built a whole basically new retail luxury event shopping town just north of this site where St. Martin's College is. And so they sold off the old one, and no one liked the building. Well, a few people like it. There's a few people who like modernism and brutalism and futurism in the UK. Not many. So most people said knock it down. But it was bought by a hotel chain to become a public space. And through, it's an American company, they wanted to work with a British designer. And so they thought, British designer. And they thought, Peter Saville. So we'd obviously ring up Peter. And we've had, I guess, a long history of working with Peter. Peter probably should be in this talk in some ways.
Peter's been a friend for a long time, probably features quite heavily in that post you saw as a sort of ley line running all the way through it. But we've we've worked with Peter, but also Peter has introduced us to people a long way through our professional careers, because Peter doesn't have a studio. So he's often approached about projects that need wider help, I guess, wider assistance or thinking or support. So there's a number of clients that are significant that have come, I guess, by Peter.
Introduced us to the Gagosian.
Gagosian was one of the first projects.
And so this works well because he doesn't kind of say, yeah, I'll do the job and then I'll get these cheaper graphic thought guys in the back room to do it and hand it over. He'll say, well, that's an interesting idea. I think you need someone, a studio working on this, and I'll make an introduction. Not always to us. You know, he's got such a network of different designers. And so Peter will stay on the project often as a kind of advisor and a kind of, you know, trusted go-between often between ourselves and a client.
Yeah, in a way, Peter, I think Peter's done something which we've never been so good at doing in some ways, in that he almost acts as a kind of design literate client-sider. So he's brought in by the designer, so he's garnered a trust. And he almost becomes a segue between us and them as a arbiter of what's good and what's bad in some ways. And
you know, there's some slightly oddness in doing this building. You know, this building was built as a public space to serve the people of Camden, and now it's going to be a quite high-price hotel. And there was a few things fitting to this. One also was the American client. Actually, they said, you know, it's kind of, the job is kind of faux. It's inventing their vision of public service in the 70s, but doing it really well, you know. So this is a book that came out a few years ago that I thought, what an odd, a very niche subject matter, a Taschen book on the reception lobbies of Milanese apartments. And actually, I love this book because what's beautiful about it is these spaces, some are by famous architects, Scarpa, Ponti, a lot are anonymous, but they're made with such quality, and then they're looked after so well, and they endure, and they maybe go in and out of fashion. Maybe some people move because they think their lobby looks old-fashioned, but most people, it seem to stay there, and it's just beautifully made and looked after. And in a way, that became the brief for the hotel. It becomes this 1970s public space that never was but could have been, and let's make it as well as it could have been. So, given this principle, the first thing we had to design, oddly, was a carpet, and that's just to do with contractors, and they need the carpet 2 years before it's ready, and crazy stuff. And when you go back to that entrance, you'll see, you know, particularly of this time, things will come and go, and you know, Terrazzo's kind of certainly had its moment, and there's a lot about. But again, it was a beautiful polished floor in there, the Terrazzo, and we thought, well, this could come up to the floors upstairs. But rather than just be a geometric pattern, it could perhaps be part of this archaeology of the 1960s and 70s and going back. So the concept sketch on the right, which is just chopped up bits of photocopy, is the idea that we would find slabs of 70s carpet, almost as if we could mine them from a quarry, like marble, and then lay them down to make this carpet. And, you know, some nostalgia for us. The shot on the left is the Crucible Theatre in Sheffield, you know, one of the, actually is a modernist building that's still loved and looked after. And I remember going there as a kid and just seeing that space and that carpet, and it was like, this is just futuristically brilliant when you go to the pantomime. So we would do tests for ourselves, very raw, and we think, yeah, this could work. You cut out some paper and stick some models on it. And by and by, we got to a design. Now, this would be produced on a big loom out in Carolina, in America, and it has to be sliced into 4 strips because the carpet has to be laid in the same way, or the pile looks wrong. All sorts of things we learnt on this, and that's a joy of learning techniques. So actually through there's 4, it's hard to see, but there are 4 lines where you can divide this. So it becomes a big colour printout in our studio. So you think, yeah, okay, this begins to work, and you take it into the space. And then it becomes a reality in the space. So these corridors up there just have plain white walls. The rooms are quite rich, but the corridors are quite bare. So in a way, that sense, the carpet's allowed to be quite wild up here. And yeah, hopefully a surprise that it's a woolen terrazzo. There's some nice little gifts in there. So I think, the shape at the front is California, but we're not sure if any of our American guests have spotted that. And then the porridge. I don't know what the technical term is for the bits of terrazzo that holds the big bits together. Porridge is not a...
Porridge is good.
Yeah, Scottish breakfast. So the porridge then, through the corridor, seeps out and goes under the doors to the room. So when you're in a room, you just get porridge. So you're not blinded by a huge bit of a Sheffield theatre in the 1970s. And it becomes easy to clean and hide stains. That's pragmatic. And then it goes back outside. So we think, okay, what else is going to be the big deal in sustaining this identity is the typography, as seen in the door push there. And this time we didn't go to Helvetica, I think, for inspiration. We thought that's kind of not got that 70s Italian turned-up collar flareness of this. So I think based on former, and again, used for very public-facing civic type work, but having a little bit of, don't care so muchness about it, is a joy. So from that, we drew up a font that we could control, was very clear, legible, crisply set, but it had this built-in softness again. And the softness was important technically because through looking at the architecture samples in the space, we knew we were going to end up doing a lot of routing and cutting out of this world. So by the letters having small radii in the corner, when the milling machine comes around, it makes the letter perfectly rather than a bad copy. And we played with laminates, obviously a nod to Gio Ponti, Italian Abbott laminates, they're lead. They're put together in frames made by, a British fine art framer we knew through Frieze. And I think in this sense, he's trying to make this fantasy where we'd never seen a sign like this, but we imagined we could have seen a sign like this. And that's the joy in it. It's a theatre set, it's a playground, and we can play in there. And again, perhaps we nodding to the work, Huw had done with Chatsworth. I think we haven't got this on the website yet because we haven't worked out how to capture it best. Do you capture it as these things we've made, as like pristine little objects, or is it more about you're in a hotel and there's a hard flash on an iPhone? So we'll get there.
I think there's a talk in how to archive your imagery and tell the story. We'll come back for that one.
And then when you go underground to the toilets, so you're at King's Cross, you sit above all the underground railway lines coming together. And so this sign is made by A.J. Wells, who make all the enamel signs for London Transport. And so if you make a sign with A.J. Wells, if you pick colours of the London lines, you get it quicker and cheaper. So this is Piccadilly line blue with Hammersmith and City line pink on there. They don't like fancy different colours. But working on the colours for this project, we also got some help through a company, Wallace Sewell. And Wallace Sewell make all the many of the fabrics. So if you come to London and ride on the trains, you'll be riding on their fabrics, the maquettes.
Design the fabrics.
Yes, yeah, they design the fabrics, woven industrially. And oddly, that's back to connections, because Wallace Sewell, Emma Sewell, who's also here, and also my wife, this was one of our first logos we got to do as a company. So, you know, that's very early on there. And also, if London, you go to another iconic thing, you got the work of Sophie.
So, yeah, who's my...
So when you've got it, you've not even got the best designers in our households talking to you tonight. You've got the B team. But anyway, so this notion of process and working off that carries on. So we got into this idea of routing because the building itself was kind of cut through. You know, it was not precious anymore. So they were routing holes in cores that would open up and become a bar. And so you get nice little tasks to do. So we had to come up with a bar token for giving free drinks away to DJs and things. So you got one. I've got one somewhere in my pocket. These were designed so you could also put them on your hand. You could look very flash with lots of free drink rings. But the soul, perhaps, of this ground floor space is the library. So there used to be a library in this very space when it was Camden Town Hall. And they employed a librarian, a Scottish lady, great fun, and she went and bought a fantastic amounts of well-chosen second-hand books. They're not just books that you buy by the meter to fill up a crap pub and make it look old. She kind of really chose the titles and then classified them in a very interesting way. And so, again, we got to, you know, work and design library shelving, which is perfect for the former and perfect for the laminate. And we could make new stamps to go in the library books. And when you're in a library, there's obviously the archive, what do you call it? The reference books, where you find what's in a library, and they're bound in the most toughest fabric. So we'll not go for something like leather here. We'll go for those tough, plasticized industrial book cover fabric. And so when you're having a drink in this space, fiction is the allure and dream of what you're going to drink and the wonderful night you have, and fact is what the bill comes in, because that's the empirical measure. And elements then begun to take a life, and they keep coming around and joining together in different ways. So I think we got to materiality is in here, typography is in here, and maybe also just a way of speaking is in here, a language identity. So the language on here is kind of slightly overly formal, as you might get in a slightly stiff English service, perhaps. Thank you. Is that okay? Yes, good. We will hopefully see you again sometime soon. Thank you. You know, it's not so much hi guys, whatever, ciao. And in the details in there, another perhaps common theme to be used is ready-made parts, just slightly used in different ways. So that's a very standard ring binder shipped in. These were bought from Germany because we found that in Germany you can get your ring binder mechanism sprayed in a RAL for a very reasonable price. That's before the pound was worth $0. And so we build a palette of normality. These are all normal things, but it's just trying to curate that palette of them to make it.
Which is a reoccurring thing, I think, isn't it? Well,
Yeah.
often trying to take things out of context. The idea that you can take something very familiar, well, like in this case, a scaffolding system, key clamp. I'm not sure you have it here or not, but it's a very inexpensive, flexible system for an exhibition we did at the Design Museum on Alan Fletcher. But if you take it, usually you see it in raw galvanized steel. But actually, if you take it and you colour it, suddenly it becomes something else and has a different mood. So this idea of taking something familiar and just shifting it a degree, suddenly it feels kind of different.
Yeah, and sometimes that opportunity's there. Sometimes it's wrong to shift those things. So we didn't design the lift button control panel on the right there, which out of a whim of let's be different ended up being horizontal when the building is vertical. And that getting that past the fire brigade, that one aspect of that decision was probably worth, and this is not a lie, like 730 emails just to discuss this, and I think it nearly broke poor Anastasia, who works with us. So there's sometimes it's not like, hey, let's do this differently. Sometimes like, no, just don't. And then now we had a theme, so we could run with that through. So downstairs was this, like say, public space of 1970s, high quality, welcoming for the people. Upstairs, where we got our terrazzo carpet, it's a bit more of a kind of pop playground. You can wander in the street and go downstairs, but to go up to the guest rooms, you've kind of paid your money, so you're up, and it gets slightly popper. So the same idea for the signage, but this time in acrylics, matte and gloss acrylics, but the same techniques and layered. Crash comes back, so the idea that room service is just yes and no, so just moulding two pieces together through foam, you can turn that around. When we got down to that minimal language, that kind of went back to Alan Fletcher again, because that show, because a full-on 1970s album cover for a full-on 1970s band just saying yes, and that seemed a spirit that could come back. So you've got tools now. We can apply them. We use the rounded shape, just echoes from the building. So you've got these rooms that everything has got this slightly rounded, soft feel. Not quite Barbarella, but heading that way. And there's a Wally Sewell bed throw on there. And you can order your continental breakfast in bed. I've heard continental breakfast is very good. I'll try one tomorrow. And we're just about out of slides, very close, because then this building goes on up and you would get another gear change. So when you get up to the new floors, they've become something else. They've moved out of the 1970s building and they are now a kind of luxe sky apartment up there. So the materiality just changed again. So we got polished chrome and these deep blue laminates. And I say there's then a whole other world. And so I guess for this project we got to design the collateral for 2 restaurants and a bar and another bar, but that's...
It's about 5 projects, 6 projects.
So there's too much, but in some ways it becomes a dream thing when you just get a script and a client who I guess will say, yeah, let's take this and have fun. All the time everything's got to cost the right amount of money, it's got to be durable, it's got to be cleanable, and I think that's the rational bit that is still always underpinning, but then on finding to put play on top. And I don't know if that makes us Swiss or not. I've got no idea. We'll have to have a vote.
It's time for you to decide.
Yeah, that's us done. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we were going to sit here, and if there's time, sorry, it's hot, and you've been here a long time. I'm sorry we talked so long.
No, if it's interesting, time doesn't matter. So please take a seat. And alors, ce sera l'occasion, si vous avez des questions, c'est maintenant ou jamais. Ils sont ici. On a un peu de temps encore, et après, il y a quelque chose à boire et une petite chose à manger. Alors, si l'anglais passe pas très bien, il n'y a pas de problème, vous faites en français et on traduit.
I've got one. Do you work on text also? Because you talk about materials, about feelings, about things, and do you design text not as typographer but as writer?
Maybe short text. So I think we would have a go at designing a very short bit of text that we thought was witty. I think in the past we used to be terrible in the sense that, especially on very commercial jobs, we would get the copy in and go, oh, this copy's terrible. Anyway, let's set it. And not, I think now you realise you can be a bit more proactive on that, and perhaps less of just the service industry of taking it. So it's nice to be in that conversation without, but I can't come into that conversation from a point of great knowledge or skill, not being a writer. I mean, interesting thinking of Vitra when we worked with Abby, that kind of came the core. Yeah, writing became the core.
And also that, sorry. I'll take that. I think it's, yeah, I think actually, I think the honest answer to that is probably yes. The reality is we don't do written tone of voice, but actually, and you're really great with words, Andy, as demonstrated. I think often we will have opportunities to chew on something and make words a significant part of what we're doing, and have an opportunity to maybe push those the way we would like them to. Very small example, there was a project there for Vitra, which is there's two parts to that. There's two companions. One's called Our Clients, and the other is called Our Clients, and the other is called Your Office, which is a very simple thing. It's not a big deal. But the Vitra didn't have that before we came in. It's a very nice thing to typeset. It's got a nice shape to it. It's got a nice form. But I think the other one is, although, again, it's not something that we got involved in terms of directly writing, but in terms of writing being the kind of crux for an idea, we, again, for Vitra, the very first project we did for Vitra 14 years ago or so was a publication called Work Spirit. And work spirit, I mean, actually at the point, I don't think anyone could really define what work spirit was, but work spirit in essence was someone's take for that minute on, this is going to sound really boring, office furniture. And it had, in previous years, it had Rolf Feldbaum, who's then CEO of Vitra, had probably done what he did with us, which was knock on our door, literally knock on our door and saying, I'm Rolf, fancy doing work spirit. And so he'd given the opportunity for a designer to be an author, which is an odd place for us to sit, because I think one thing, many things that we've probably missed out tonight, but something we can certainly talk about is that the idea of authorship. Of course, we all have a sort of a number of traits that might use. You might see a piece of GTF work and go, I think that's GTF work or GTF inspired. But I think we're very clear that we work to a brief, and that the authorship is about the problem, not about us. So actually, we kind of pushed it to be to be a straighter thing in a way. But the thing that I guess the biggest quirk is that we wanted something to hang the story on, hang the narrative on. And actually, what we decided to do was to commission a play. And of that play, it was 4 acts, and each one of those acts. This is actually kind of related to the fact that Rolf used to talk about his products being a cast. Each one of those acts we illustrated, and we illustrated with a set that we designed, and we used furniture. And at the time, my sister's a writer. My sister's a film and TV writer. So it was an opportunity to bring someone in that we were close to. Again, that list of connections, it's an important thing. I think it's partly because, of course, is it what you know or who you know? But it's actually, as much as anything else, it's about creating friendships that you can go, I trust. And that would be hard to maybe just pick someone to do that, but to do it with my sister was a much more straightforward thing to do.
And even the greatest writers will write for a free chair.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
just swap stuff.
It's a nice. It is. There's something very nice. There's something very nice and old-fashioned about it. It was for an Eames recliner, and an ottoman, which she still has. So
I think in that, just to wrap up on that, I think that's lovely to be involved with writing. It's so important. But I think, like as Huw says, it's probably not going to come from us, and maybe because we are, like I say, unshakably more commercial artists. Put it graphic. We're not quite sure what that term is, but maybe it's a kind of more old-fashioned way. But we quite like that problem and finding out about what the client wants to say and trying to find a way in. And so hopefully, formally, it's of us and it's got our character in the answer. But exactly as you say, it's not our agenda.
Yeah, we recognise it, but it's not.
Autre question?
Listen, I'm going to start singing if you don't start asking questions. That's the hardest thing. I'll ask you a question. How about that? Did you always want to be a graphic designer? I've got two questions actually. Actually, I've got questions. I've got questions to you guys because I've got there's one which I find really hard to answer. But the first one is: did you always want to be a graphic designer, Andy?
Of course not. I wanted to be a professional footballer.
Yeah. Every Thursday night, aren't you a professional footballer?
I just, in a very shallow way, maybe back to, we were chatting before about different education systems and saying, there's a joy certainly that can be found in British art schools, because if you find an idea or area of exploration and you want to go with it, I generally found you'll get encouraged and you can go there. I thought learned at a particularly good time when we had lovely venerable tutors like Derek Birdsall was a wonderful British designer, and he would constantly challenge us to be surprised and go somewhere new, but say, why have you gone there? And if you couldn't answer that, he was less interested. But in a much shallow way, before I got that far, I just wanted to do, record covers and posters like a lot of people. That was it,
And the second question is, because this is the one I need to, I need to answer this because I need to be able to tell my mum, what is a graphic designer? It's a really hard one to answer.
That's a question also that a lot of the students have to, from time to time, and we also have to explain to people we think they would know, but not always.
Well, it's really, oh yeah, I do this, and I do a cover, and I did a record, and I did this, and I mean, it doesn't sound very interesting, does it? But it's not. It's about one of the most interesting design disciplines I think there is.
There's an anecdote quote from Vince Frost. You know him? Yeah, he's a designer, so a British guy working in Australia. And he says he showed something to his mum, and his mum, it's his son. She would always love his work. He said, oh, look, Mum, we've just done this, and we got a prize for it. And she went, that's lovely. What did you do? Did you take the photograph? Did you print the book? Did you this? And he said he found himself struggling to tell his mum what he did, though she was very proud of him. And I think he's written a book about that, which I've read around without reading it, but maybe Vince has got the answer.
On va lui inviter une autre fois. Alors, d'autres questions?
Well, thank you for this brilliant and very entertaining talk. I also have a question kind of around words, and I wondered if you could say a little bit about the name of your studio, which is this, adding 3 words together, and what is the graphic thought? What is the facility you're giving, or could you say something about that?
Andy, you're on this one.
Yeah. I think this relates back very closely to the last question. So when I was a student in London and living with a flatmate, Nigel Robinson, who was also with us when we started GTF. Nigel's from Liverpool, a Scouser, and the guys we lived with were also from that area, but they were in civilian jobs. They worked in science or worked for the local government. And sometimes they'd say, are you coming out? Are you coming out for a drink? Are you coming out now? And it's like, no, we've got to finish our poster. And the Liverpool response was, get a fuck. Which is literally means that's get away with you. And so GTF stuck as a term. It just became GTF. And so when we actually had to become a company, we wrote long lists of words beginning with G and T and F, and finally we found those 3, and not just found that. In a way, that is also an homage. There's a design research unit where a great design company in Britain through the 60s, 70s, and that kind of name had gone out of fashion. When we were students, everyone was called Clear and Smash and Wow or whatever. And so doing something contrary as graphic thought facility seemed good. After 30 years of saying on the phone, no, not thought, and having the longest email in the world, it's a terrible idea. But it's kind of stuck. So I think, it's one of those bad names we've grown into. Maybe like a kind of Arctic Monkeys, for a Sheffield reference of that one.
As I'm saying this objectively, because I was not involved in this, but I think one thing that always struck me, which I think was relevant, is the fact that you're working in a bedroom, but you had a name that implied something way bigger. There was a sort of there was a certain irony. There was a certain irony in it. You're trying to make it as corporate as you can, as you said, as in part as an antidote to the smashes and the targets and the big and the haze of that generation.
But there was a genuine love for design research unit. You know, they thought hard and made beautiful work, and so we would love to, you know, be seen as learning from them and part of that lineage. So there's a serious side to it, but GTF, that's really where it came from. I think I'm probably the same colour as the floor now.
And it makes it really hard on Instagram as well.
Yeah, and then when so we started pre-internet, obviously, and when the internet came along, we thought, oh, we'll register GTF, but that was the German Tourist Federation or something in London, so we were out for that one, so we were gone.
Dernière question, autrement.
Hello. You famously did a lot of work for the Shakespeare Globe Theatre, and I was just curious, why did they stop working with you, and what's your opinion of the kind of communication they've been doing since they don't work with you anymore?
Should I take this one?
Yeah, and then we've got some as well. Yeah, you say
firstly, yes. What do we think of it? What was the first bit of the question? It was how we came to it, or just why we stopped. Okay. Yeah, I think technically the word is sacked. No, there must be a sort of, I don't know, mutually ejected or something. I think. Yeah, I think basically there is a bit of story behind that. Okay, and I think that, there's lots of themes that one could talk about, and I think qualities of client is one of them. And actually, we came to that. I mean, you had a starting point in theatre, didn't you? Because you were working for Chelsea Theatre right in the early days.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, when that big show of Alan Fletcher's work was up, might not have noticed, but there was a tiny poster on the left of one of the shots, and it was for a little theatre above a pub in North London. And I only saw it in putting the talk together. It's like, oh, Christ, we did theatres for that pub starting out. So we had a little bit of that. But really, I think it came as a hand-me-down from it was from Angus, a partner at Pentagram London, and an old friend. And I think they just couldn't carry on working for no money, or they'd worked for... We could. They'd worked for the previous artistic director, and maybe they thought they were going to get the push. And to be honest, we were a little bit iffy about the Globe, because it seemed, is it a bit of a tourist type thing?
It's a bit hey nonny new, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, funny hat and do that. But we said we'd go down and meet the new artistic director, who is an actor himself, Mark Rylance, who's a quite amazing stage actor and film now, and just his personality, we were just like, okay, we'll do the job. You know, we're in.
Yeah, and so when that happened, we had this idea of shooting, it's trying to find ways in. You know, it's a little bit like Chatsworth House. How do you find a way in? Actually, it's got a lot of similarity to Chatsworth House. You know, it's a bit uncool. It's got a tradition to it. It's got a formality to it. And Andy said it was verging on a kind of novelty piece, because
and also I think, like the Standard, actually, I'm just thinking of that. It was a real fake. Is that what Holly Golightly says in Breakfast at Tiffany's? It was set up as this kind of nostalgia. Let's go back. But Mark convinced us that they were going to do like tough acting and really great stuff, and go back to the kind of gutturalness of putting a play on in that time and getting the crowd wound up and involved. So actually, we were like, wow, we're in because of that. And it was the work. Then there's a whole story of the work itself, which was fun.
Well, I think the work. I think that I guess it goes back to Mark in terms of the work. It goes back to Mark Rylance, who was creative director there. We had this idea of trying to shoot a very traditional thing, but to try and include the inevitable modern elements in it. For those of you who don't know, Shakespeare's Globe is on the South Bank in London, and is built on the site of the original Globe, which was built by Shakespeare. And there's, I think I'm right in thinking there's not a single screw in it. It's built absolutely authentically, and it was the original intention, which it still does, was to do all productions in what they call original practices. So it's original clothing, no lighting. If it rains, it has a central core which is exposed to the rain. If it rains, it rains. And as Andy had said, it was somewhere between it being a kind of, you know, a tourist trap and a sort of museum piece, and Mark wanted to change that. So there was this idea of, okay, points of contrast, you know, that happens a lot in the work we do, was to try and photograph this with all those contemporary elements in there. And actually, the first person to shoot it was effectively the in-house photographer, who just could not get it. I mean, it just couldn't get it. It was actors doing, you know, sort of pulling funny shapes and sort of putting bananas in inappropriate places. And there was one shot right at the end of the roll. It was like a mistake. It was like he'd put it on the table and he'd just fired it, and it was, I forget what it was, the first image we used. I think it was one guy. I think that's right. It's just two guys, all dressed in their traditional outfits, and they're just lying there, sitting there like this. I think one of them might be reading a newspaper, and it was a mistake. He wasn't even going to show it to us, and it was like, that's the image. That's exactly the tonality of it. And Mark was exactly the same. He was like, that's the thing. And without that, we would have been back to, you know, hey, nonny new, and people sort of throwing funny, odd shapes. So that's how the work came about. In terms of how it ended, we were sacked. But through no fault of our own, we were sacked. Basically, it changed up creative directors. The last project we did one season with them, and it was actually a very nice piece. It's a very nice piece of print. It was called Regime Change, and it was based on a number of plays that dealt with regime change. And one of the sort of motifs we used was based on actually, I think one of the plays was Romulus and Remus. Was kind of taking elements of graffiti from around Rome.
Like if you're a Roma fan,
yeah,
in Italy, and you see it sprayed the walls.
And we had a very simple photograph of the theatre, and we had this big bit of graffiti on the front. Effectively, it wasn't even graffiti; it was a big bit of sprayed motif. So it was done with a spray can, and London Transport, the underground system, wouldn't let us put it on. And the theatre wouldn't sort of back us on it, and it sort of just gradually decayed the relationship from there. Really, it happened. Look, it happens.
Yeah, and I think, you know, through your careers in that, it will happen the other way as well. You know, sometimes a new creative director appears and they want to work with you, and you get the gig, and there was someone there before. So, you know, we can't moan about that.
I mean, and there are other projects that we've left because you reach a natural sort of end. Freeze Art Fair, we left because it got to a natural conclusion. Photo London, I think I was also sacked from Photo London, but anyway.
But there's also maybe, this is not always the case, but maybe a type of client who is you have the term like a benign dictator. Yeah. So in that sense, they can take your work and they can push that through, and that can happen with a lot of clients, and you have a run, and then the client gets bigger and they need to devolve to other managers, and the managers don't have the confidence to back that, and the work, as Huw says, might just slowly get safer and a little bit thing, and the job's still there and it's still paying. But that only becomes sad then when you see something else you wanted to do and you can't do it because you haven't got the time, because you're doing the idea you're not very pleased about again. So it's a tricky time to kind of jump, you know, leave a regular client. But I don't think we've ever done that and felt bad but regretted it.
No, it was the right decision. And just one final thing I would say: we do have a lot of clients who have been with us a long time. So it's only, it's not a normal thing that. So we have cornerstone clients who we've worked with for 13, 14, 15 years.
Yeah, Vitra, Badrat,
Gagosian, yeah,
like that.
Joe Gordon, and Wallace Huw.
Ok. Bon, je pense la conversation peut continuer pendant un verre. Voilà. Thank you very much.
Thank you.